In fact, let's continue here. As that conflict escalates in Eastern Europe, Russia has been urged by the African Union, ironically, to respect international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, while Russia's influence on the continent has been steadily increasing in recent years, it still pales in comparison to the Soviet Union's dominance in post-colonial Africa from the 1950s through to the 1970s. Some post-colonial African leaders linked themselves or likened themselves to the USSR as an alternative to Western imperialism, capitalism, and going as far as adopting philosophies, if you like, ranging from socialism to Marxist-Leninism. Let's discuss all of this for you now. Place into context Africa's history with Russia and what that means for the relationship going forward. Bring in our guest, Dr. Bob Wekesa, who is the acting director for the African Center for the Study of the United States. Doc, thanks for your time, and it's lovely to have you on the program. And, you know, we actually didn't plan it this way, but, you know, the instances of apparent racial profiling that are taking place at some borders and what we're seeing take place inside Ukraine, given the work that you've been able to do, what, if anything, are you reading into that?
No, I think it's loaded with lots of meaning, the racial profiling as people, Africans flee alongside other nationalities from Ukraine. I think one of the big point there is that this war between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, can actually be said to be some form of tribalism in Europe itself. Between Ukrainians and Russians specifically. But when you bring in the other communities in Europe, you can actually call them tribes, as it were, as the way the continent is referred to. But they're fighting amongst themselves. But when a black African appears on the scene, there's always then the otherness, the othering. Even though we are fighting among ourselves, a black African looks so much more different than us. That creates another layer of the tribalism in quotes that we're talking about, taking the racial perspectives. And I think then one wonders how African countries, African leaders who have actually kind of asked Russians to step back in support of Ukraine will take it. They have issued statements, the AU, a number of African countries. But when they see that, then a new angle appears of how do we protect Africans now, because they're also involved in this.
Yeah, and the irony, of course, is that Africa can't even send its own flights to Ukraine because, all flights have been suspended. I mean, in the face of that, is this another instance where, sadly, Africa is going to have to watch helplessly as some of their own countrymen suffer the kind of, call it layered injustice as the situation unfolds in Eastern Europe?
No, certainly. In fact, this recalls just a couple of months when the pandemic hit, when COVID-19 was reported, across borders, particularly in China, when African countries, just as in this situation, Africans living in China particularly, were left to their own devices. And they were only, even as other powerful countries with capabilities were able to arrange the repatriation of their citizens back home. But I think on a global scale, then one sees the inequalities, even in a war such as this. Not just inequalities between Russia and Ukraine, Russia being the stronger force here. But when you look at it from a global perspective, Africa then appears in almost every circumstance to even be lower in ranking, including in matters of humanitarian assistance to nationals, facing all these tribulations in Eastern Europe. It will have been interesting to see if the UN will have intervened to help everybody. But I doubt the UN, including the UN Refugee Agency, really likely going to see European countries coming to say, let's help Africans. It's actually everybody for himself, and kind of everybody else then has to help themselves.
Yeah. Of course, in the backdrop, we need to take into cognizance Africa's history with the USSR, which some people are viewing as, if you like, a body representing Russia largely, because Russia was the biggest state within the USSR. But we know in the past that the USSR itself had assisted many African states gain independence through the form of sometimes military aid. Do you reckon that's the reason that we're not seeing this kind of unanimous condemnation coming from the continent to Russia, as is the case, arguably in the West?
I think that's part of it, but it's not the whole story. Obviously, countries on the continent that went the Eastern Bloc way or went communist, socialist, included Angola, included Mozambique, Tanzania, Guinea, and a few others. And they will have very close ties with Russia. But I think the bigger point here is that those Cold War kind of nuances on the African continents have subsided quite substantially. So much so that now actually African countries might not be in support of Russia so much, because I think in this particular war, the balance of power is towards more towards bigger, should I say, bigger capacities, a big role for the Western powers and Russia. Russia is the underdog here if you look at it from a global perspective. For that reason, I think African countries will be looking carefully on which side their comments should go, which is why even their condemnation of Russia is very muted. It's not very strong, because they understand that Russia has power, but all the same they have to issue a statement to say we do not like the idea that Russia could invade Ukraine.
A lot to consider there. Dr. Bob Wekesa, thanks very much indeed for your insights.